Grace Williams stood in the grand foyer of the Caldwell estate, her hand gripping Victoria Sinclair's wrist so tightly that the diamond bracelet dug into both their skin. The slap never landed. Instead, the sound that echoed through the marble halls was Victoria's gasp of disbelief, a woman who had never been defied by a servant in her entire life. No one moved. The other maids stood frozen against the walls, eyes wide, breath held. The cook dropped her spatula somewhere in the kitchen. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to pause its ticking. Grace also had no idea that Nathan Caldwell, the billionaire owner of this mansion and Victoria's fiancé, was standing in the shadowed hallway just 15 feet away, watching everything unfold. And she certainly didn't know that Randy William, the man Victoria feared more than anyone else in the world, had just stepped through the service entrance at that exact moment. What happened next would shatter the carefully constructed lies Victoria had built over the years. It would expose secrets buried so deep that even the dead would rise to demand justice. And it would change Grace Williams' life in ways she never imagined when she first walked through these gilded doors just 3 days ago. But before we get to that part, let me tell you the story from the very beginning. Those seemingly ordinary moments that led to this explosive confrontation. If you enjoy stories about truth, justice, and the courage it takes to stand up against cruelty, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss any part of it. So, what brought Grace Williams to this mansion? And what dark secrets were hiding behind its beautiful walls? 3 days earlier, Grace Williams stepped off the Greyhound bus in Greenwich, Connecticut, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and a heart full of desperate hope. The October wind cut through her thin jacket as she looked up at the address written on a crumpled piece of paper. Caldwell Estate. The name alone sounded like something from a fairy tale. She was 24 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and green eyes that held more weariness than someone her age should carry. Back home in rural Kentucky, her mother lay in a hospital bed, fighting a battle against cancer that required treatments the insurance wouldn't cover. Grace had sold everything, her car, her furniture, even her grandmother's ring, but it still wasn't enough. When the employment agency called about a live-in position at a wealthy estate in Connecticut, she didn't hesitate. The pay was 3 times what she could make waitressing back home. 3 months here, and she could cover her mother's next round of chemotherapy. The iron gates of the Caldwell estate swung open automatically as she approached. The driveway stretched for what seemed like a quarter mile, lined with ancient oak trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. At the end stood the mansion, 3 stories of gray stone and tall windows, ivy climbing up the eastern wall, a fountain in the circular drive that probably cost more than Grace's childhood home. Beautiful, but cold. Like a museum where no one actually lived. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, met her at the service entrance. She was a thin woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed permanently tired. "You must be Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper even though they were alone. "Come in quickly, and remember, speak softly, work invisibly, and never, ever talk back." Grace frowned slightly. "Talk back to whom?" Mrs. Patterson glanced toward the main house, something flickering in her eyes. Fear? Warning? "Miss Victoria Sinclair, Mr. Caldwell's fiancée. She lives here now, and she—" The older woman paused, choosing her words carefully. "She has very high standards." That night, Grace learned exactly what high standards meant. She was polishing the silverware in the dining room when she heard the shouting from upstairs. A crash, then sobbing. Minutes later, Maria, one of the other maids, a small woman from Guatemala who had worked at the estate for 5 years, came down the servants' stairs with a red handprint blazing across her cheek and tears streaming down her face. "What happened?" Grace rushed toward her. Maria shook her head violently. Don't ask. Don't get involved. If you want to survive here, you learn to be invisible. You learn to say yes. You learn to take whatever she gives you. She hit you. She does worse. Maria's voice cracked. Last month, she accused Elena of stealing a pair of earrings. Elena was fired on the spot. No references, no severance. Mr. Caldwell was traveling, and by the time he came back, Elena was already gone. She wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. The earrings? Miss Victoria found them in her other jewelry box 3 days later. She laughed about it. Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. And no one tells Mr. Caldwell? He's never here, always traveling for business. And when he is here, Maria lowered her voice even further. She's different around him, sweet, gentle, the perfect fiancée. He has no idea who she really is. That night, Grace lay in her small room in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling. She thought about her mother, about the hospital bills, about the 3 months she needed to survive in this place. She thought about Maria's bruised face and Elena's destroyed career. She thought about her cousin Lily, who had worked at an estate just like this one years ago. Lily, who had died under mysterious circumstances that were never fully explained. Lily, whose death still haunted Grace's family like an unanswered question. No. She pushed that thought away. She was here for her mother, nothing else. She would be invisible. She would say yes. She would survive. But Grace William had never been good at staying silent when witnessing injustice, and the next 2 days would test every ounce of her resolve. The morning of the 3rd day began like any other. Gray clouds hung low over the estate, threatening rain. Grace was assigned to clean the West Wing, Victoria's personal quarters. Mrs. Patterson had given her strict instructions. Knock 3 times, wait for permission, never touch anything on the vanity, and leave immediately if dismissed. Grace knocked, waited, knocked again. "Come in," Victoria's voice rang out, sharp and impatient. The room was enormous, a sitting area, a walk-in closet the size of Grace's entire apartment back home, and a canopy bed draped in silk. Victoria Sinclair sat at her vanity, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her blue eyes fixed on her reflection as she applied lipstick. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, polished, pristine, and utterly cold. "You're the new one," Victoria said without turning around. "The country girl." "Yes, ma'am." "Grace William." "I don't care what your name is." Victoria capped her lipstick. "I care that you do your job without being seen or heard. Can you manage that?" "Yes, ma'am." Grace began dusting the bookshelf, moving quietly, efficiently. For 20 minutes, everything was fine. Victoria scrolled through her phone, occasionally sighing dramatically about some social engagement or another. Then Victoria stood up abruptly, her hand flying to her neck. "My bracelet!" Her voice was ice. "My diamond bracelet! Where is it?" Grace turned. "I'm sorry?" "The Van Cleef bracelet. It was on my vanity this morning. Now it's gone." Victoria's eyes narrowed, scanning the room before landing on Grace. You've been in here for 20 minutes. Where is it?" "I haven't touched anything on your vanity, ma'am. I was told—" "I don't care what you were told." Victoria's voice rose to a shriek. She stormed toward the door and flung it open. "Everyone, get up here now!" Within minutes, the staff had assembled in the hallway outside Victoria's room. Mrs. Patterson, Maria, 2 other maids, Jennifer and Rosa, Henry, the groundskeeper, even Raymond, the chef, wiping flour from his hands. Victoria paced before them like a prosecutor before a jury. "Someone in this house stole my diamond bracelet. It's worth $50,000. $50,000. She stopped in front of Maria. "Was it you? You've always been jealous of my things." "No, Miss Victoria, I swear—" Victoria's hand flew out, slapping Maria across the face so hard that the smaller woman stumbled backward. Grace felt her hands curl into fists at her sides. Was it you? Victoria moved to Jennifer, who flinched and shook her head frantically. You? Rosa began crying before Victoria even reached her. Then Victoria stopped in front of Grace. Her lips curved into a cruel smile. The new girl. From nowhere. With nothing. I bet you've never seen anything worth $50,000 in your entire pathetic life. She leaned closer, her perfume cloying and expensive. Did you take it to pay for whatever sad little emergency brought you to my doorstep? Grace's jaw tightened. I didn't take anything. Liar. Victoria's eyes flashed. You're all liars and thieves. She raised her hand, palm open, ready to strike. But this time, something different happened. Grace's hand shot up and caught Victoria's wrist mid-swing. She held it there, firm but not violent, her green eyes meeting Victoria's blue ones without a trace of fear. No, Grace said quietly. You don't get to hit me. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face went through a rapid transformation, shock, then disbelief, then pure volcanic rage. How dare you touch me? Do you know who I am? I'll have you thrown out on the street. I'll make sure you never work anywhere again. You'll what, Victoria? The voice came from the hallway, deep, calm, and carrying an authority that made Victoria freeze mid-sentence. Nathan Caldwell stepped into view. He was tall, with dark hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd just arrived from somewhere, and brown eyes that were currently fixed on his fiancée with an expression Grace couldn't quite read. Confusion? Concern? Something deeper? Nathan! Victoria's voice transformed instantly, softer, sweeter, the rage vanishing like it had never existed. Darling, you're home early. This girl, this new maid, I saw, Nathan said quietly. I've been standing in the hallway for the past 5 minutes. His gaze moved to Maria's reddened cheek, to the tears on Rosa's face, to the trembling servants pressed against the walls. I saw everything. Victoria opened her mouth, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension. So did I. Everyone turned toward the service staircase. A man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and the kind of face that looked like it had seen too much of the world's darkness. He wore a simple black suit, and his eyes were fixed on Victoria with an intensity that made her visibly shrink back. Randy William, former head of security for the Sinclair family, the man who had trained Victoria in self-defense when she was a teenager, the man who knew every secret the Sinclair family had ever tried to bury, the man Victoria feared. Randy. Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. What are you doing here? Randy didn't answer her. Instead, he looked at Nathan Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, I came here today because I have information you need to hear. Information about the woman you're planning to marry. He paused, letting the words sink in. But it seems I arrived just in time to witness her true character for myself. Randy, don't... Victoria started. 5 years. Randy cut her off, his voice flat and cold. 5 years I watched you terrorize household staff. 5 years I watched you manipulate, lie, and destroy anyone who got in your way. I kept quiet because your father paid me to keep quiet, but I'm not on his payroll anymore. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. I have recordings, Mr. Caldwell. Audio recordings of Miss Victoria discussing how she planned to take control of your assets after the wedding, how she planned to isolate you from your family, how she referred to you as, and I quote, a useful idiot with a trust fund. Victoria's face went white. Those are fabricated. He's lying. Nathan, darling, you can't believe. I also have evidence, Randy continued, ignoring her, of something far more serious. Something that happened at the Sinclair estate 5 years ago. Something involving a young maid named Lily William who died under circumstances that were ruled an accident. His eyes flickered briefly to Grace. But I don't believe it was an accident. And I don't think Miss William here believes it either. Every pair of eyes turned to Grace. She stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. How did he know? She had told no one. She had been so careful. Grace? Nathan's voice was gentle but confused. What is he talking about? Grace closed her eyes. She had come here for her mother. Just for her mother. But the truth had a way of demanding to be spoken, no matter how desperately you tried to keep it buried. Lily William, she said softly, was my cousin. The room erupted. Victoria screamed that it was a setup. Nathan demanded explanations. The servants whispered among themselves. Randy stood like a stone in the chaos, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. But before anyone could make sense of what was happening, the front door burst open and a man rushed in, silver-haired, distinguished, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars. Richard Sinclair, Victoria's father. "Where is my daughter?" His voice was panicked in a way that seemed utterly out of character for a man of his stature. "Victoria, we need to talk. Now. It's urgent." "Daddy?" Victoria's voice cracked. "What's wrong?" Richard Sinclair looked around the room, taking in the assembled staff, Randy Williams' cold presence, and his daughter's tear-streaked face. Whatever he had planned to say in private, it was too late for privacy now. "Someone has been following you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "For the past week, watching the estate, watching you." He pulled a crumpled letter from his pocket. "And this morning I received this." He handed the letter to Nathan, who read it aloud, his voice growing more disturbed with each word. "I know the truth about that night. I know what she did. I know who helped her cover it up, and soon everyone else will know too." Victoria let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. "No, no, no, no. Daddy, you promised. You said it was handled. You said no one would ever—" "Victoria!" Richard's voice was sharp. "Not another word." But it was too late. Everyone had heard. Everyone had seen the terror in Victoria's eyes, the terror of someone whose darkest secret was about to be dragged into the light. Nathan Caldwell stood very still, his face unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of a man who had just realized his entire world was built on lies. "What happened that night? What did you do?" The next few hours were a blur of accusations, denials, and slowly unraveling truths. Richard Sinclair tried to control the narrative. Victoria tried to deflect, manipulate, cry her way out of scrutiny. But the arrival of a USB drive, thrown over the estate wall by an unknown hand and found by Henry the groundskeeper, changed everything. They gathered in Nathan's study. Nathan, Victoria, Richard, Randy, Grace, and Mrs. Patterson as a witness. Nathan inserted the USB into his laptop, and the video began to play. The footage was grainy, clearly taken at night, but what it showed was unmistakable. A young woman in a maid's uniform running down a stone staircase, terror on her face. A figure behind her, female judging by the silhouette, wearing a bracelet that caught the light. A push. The sickening sight of the young woman tumbling down the stairs, hitting the stone landing with a sound that made Grace want to vomit. Then darkness. "That's not me!" Victoria's voice was shrill, desperate. "Someone faked this. It's a deep fake. It's—" "The bracelet," Grace said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "The bracelet in the video. It's the same Van Cleef design you accused me of stealing this morning." Victoria's face went gray. But Grace wasn't finished. She leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the frozen final frame before the video went dark. "There," she said, pointing. "In the background. There's a shadow. A second person." She looked up at Randy. "That's not a woman's build. That's a man. Someone else was there that night." Randy nodded slowly. "I've analyzed this footage. The angle is too perfect, too deliberate. Someone positioned themselves to capture exactly this moment. Someone wanted evidence of what happened." His eyes moved to Richard Sinclair. Someone who was close enough to be there, but smart enough to keep their own face out of the frame. Richard Sinclair's composure finally cracked. His hands trembled as he lowered himself into a chair. "I didn't push her," he said, his voice barely audible. "Victoria did. I helped clean it up. I paid people off. I made it go away." He looked at his daughter with something approaching disgust. "I've spent 5 years protecting you from the consequences of your own cruelty. And for what? So you could continue treating people like garbage? Daddy, don't." Richard's voice was exhausted. "Just don't." Nathan Caldwell hadn't said a word throughout this revelation. He stood by the window, staring out at the manicured grounds of his estate, his back to the room. When he finally turned around, his face was a mask of controlled devastation. "There's one thing I still don't understand," he said, looking at Grace. "Why are you really here? You said Lily was your cousin. Did you come here to... what? Get revenge? Expose Victoria?" Grace shook her head slowly. "I came here because my mother is dying. That part was true. I needed the money. I didn't even know Victoria lived here until I arrived." She paused, her voice catching. "But when I saw how she treated people, the same way witnesses said someone treated Lily before she died, I started to wonder. I started to pay attention. I didn't come here for revenge, Mr. Caldwell. I came here for the truth. Because my aunt deserves to know what really happened to her daughter." A commotion at the door interrupted them. Henry burst in, out of breath and pale. "Sir, there's a man at the gate. He says..." Henry swallowed hard. "He says he won't leave until he speaks with Miss William. He says he has the last piece of the puzzle." Everyone exchanged glances. Nathan nodded curtly. "Bring him in." The man who entered was perhaps 40 years old, with the weathered look of someone who had lived hard years. His clothes were simple: jeans, a flannel shirt, work boots. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and fixed immediately on Grace with an intensity that made her take a step back. "You don't recognize me," he said. It wasn't a question. Grace shook her head. "My name is Daniel Torres. 5 years ago, I worked at the Sinclair estate. I was a groundskeeper." His voice was steady, but underneath it ran a current of barely suppressed emotion. "I was there the night Lily William died." Victoria let out a strangled cry. Richard Sinclair buried his face in his hands. "I saw everything," Daniel continued. "I saw Miss Victoria push that poor girl down the stairs. I saw Mr. Sinclair help cover it up. I tried to report it, but they had me arrested on false theft charges. I spent 2 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. When I got out, I had nothing, no job, no references, no way to prove what I saw." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, a digital recorder, old and scratched but clearly functional. "But I had this, a recording I made that night, before they caught me." Victoria's voice, clear as day, telling her father what she'd done and begging him to make it go away. He looked at Nathan Caldwell. "I've been waiting 5 years for the right moment. When I heard Victoria was about to marry one of the richest men in America, I knew I couldn't let her get away with it. I couldn't let her destroy another family the way she destroyed Lily's." He pressed play. Victoria's voice filled the room, younger but unmistakable, sobbing and panicked. "Daddy, I didn't mean to. She just made me so angry, always looking at me like she was better than me. I pushed her, and she fell, and now she's not moving, Daddy. She's not moving. You have to help me. You have to make this go away." Richard's voice, calm and cold. "Stop crying. We'll handle this. No one will ever know." The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute. Nathan Caldwell walked slowly across the room until he stood directly in front of Victoria. She looked up at him, mascara running down her cheeks, her perfect facade completely shattered. "I loved you," Nathan said quietly. "Or I thought I did. I thought you were kind and gentle and good. I defended you to everyone who warned me. I was going to spend my life with you. Nathan, please." Victoria reached for his hand. He stepped back. "The engagement is over, and you will face justice for what you did to Lily William. Both of you." His eyes moved to Richard Sinclair. "I'll make sure of it." Victoria's face contorted with rage, the same rage Grace had seen when she'd accused the staff of stealing. "You think you're so righteous?" Victoria spat. "You're just like everyone else, weak, pathetic, fooled by a sob story from some country girl and a bitter ex-employee. I'll destroy you for this. I have connections. I have. You have nothing." Randy Williams' voice cut through her tirade. "I've already sent copies of all evidence to the district attorney's office, along with documentation of every person you've bribed, threatened, or blackmailed over the years." He smiled grimly. "Your connections are about to become your prison guards." 2 hours later, police cars lined the driveway of the Caldwell estate. Victoria Sinclair was led out in handcuffs, her designer dress wrinkled, her perfect hair disheveled, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. Richard Sinclair followed, his shoulders slumped, looking every one of his 62 years. Daniel Torres gave his statement and his recording to the police, then shook Grace's hand before leaving. "Your cousin was a good person," he said softly. "She didn't deserve what happened to her. I hope this brings your family some peace." "Thank you," Grace whispered, "for not giving up." Randy William left next, promising to testify at the trial. Mrs. Patterson gathered the staff and told them that things would be different now, that they would be treated with dignity and respect. And finally, as the sun began to set over the Connecticut hills, Grace found herself alone with Nathan Caldwell in the grand foyer where everything had begun. "I owe you an apology," Nathan said quietly. "You came here in good faith, and you were treated horribly. Not just by Victoria, but by a household that I was supposed to be running." He shook his head. "I was so busy with business, with deals, with things that seemed important. I had no idea what was happening in my own home." Grace looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Behind the wealth and the status, she saw a man who was genuinely kind, genuinely troubled by the pain others had suffered. A man who had been deceived, just like everyone else. "You couldn't have known," she said. "Victoria was very good at hiding who she really was. But I should have looked closer. I should have paid attention." Nathan paused. "Your mother, you said she needs medical treatment. Let me help. Not as payment, not as a bribe. Just let me do something good. After all the bad that happened under my roof." Grace started to refuse pride and independence warring with the desperate reality of her mother's condition. But then she thought about why she had come here in the first place, about the sacrifices she'd been willing to make. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll accept. For my mother." Nathan nodded. Then, almost hesitantly, he added, "And if you ever need anything else, a reference, a job, anything, please, don't hesitate to ask. You showed more courage in 3 days than most people show in a lifetime." Grace smiled faintly. "I didn't do anything special. I just told the truth." "That's exactly what was special about it." Nathan looked out the window at the fading light. "In a world full of people who lie to protect themselves, you chose honesty, even when it could have cost you everything." He turned back to her, and for a moment, something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but the recognition of kindred spirits. Two people who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. "You changed everything," Nathan said softly. "Just with truth and courage." 1 week later, Grace Williams stood at her mother's bedside in a private hospital room in Kentucky. The treatment had begun. The doctors were optimistic. Her mother was sleeping peacefully, color returning to her cheeks for the first time in months. Grace looked out the window at the autumn leaves, falling in the hospital courtyard. So much had changed in such a short time. Victoria was awaiting trial. Richard Sinclair had turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. Daniel Torres had been officially exonerated of the false charges against him, and Lily's case had been reopened. Her death would finally be investigated as the crime it was. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Patterson. "The staff wanted you to know things are different here now. Better. We talk about you all the time. You're a hero to us." Grace smiled and typed back. "I'm no hero. I just did what anyone should do." But even as she sent the message, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Not everyone stood up against cruelty. Not everyone chose truth over safety. Not everyone was willing to risk everything for justice. She had. And because she had, a family finally had answers. A man had been freed from false accusations, and a household of people who had lived in fear were now able to work in dignity. Kindness didn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it came in small acts of courage, catching a wrist before it struck, speaking a truth that others were afraid to speak, standing firm when everyone else told you to bend. And sometimes, those small acts changed everything. 6 months later, a brief article appeared in the Greenwich Gazette. Sinclair heiress sentenced in cold case death. Victoria Sinclair, 28, was sentenced to 15 years in prison for her role in the 2019 death of household employee Lily William. Her father, Richard Sinclair, received 5 years for obstruction of justice. The case was reopened after new evidence emerged, including testimony from a wrongfully imprisoned witness and recordings that captured Sinclair admitting to the crime. When asked for comment, the victim's family released a statement. Lily was kind, hard-working, and full of dreams. She deserved so much better than what she got. We are grateful to everyone who fought to bring her justice. And somewhere in Kentucky, Grace William read the article, then set down her phone and took her mother's hand. "It's over, Mama," she whispered. "Lily can rest now." Her mother squeezed her hand and smiled. "You did good, baby. You did real good." Outside the window, the first flowers of spring were beginning to bloom. A new season, a new beginning. And in the grand halls of the Caldwell estate, now quieter and kinder, Nathan Caldwell looked at the framed photo he'd hung in the foyer, a simple image of wildflowers, sent to him by Grace with a note that read, "For the house that learned to grow again." He smiled and turned to Mrs. Patterson, who stood nearby reviewing the week's schedule. "Any word from Miss William? She called yesterday. Her mother is doing well. Grace has started nursing school." Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly. "She said to tell you that she's paying it forward volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends, helping people who feel like they have no voice." Nathan nodded slowly, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the crackling fireplace nearby. That sounds exactly like her. Because in the end, Grace William hadn't just solved a mystery or exposed a villain. She had reminded everyone in that mansion, from the billionaire owner to the newest maid, that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and standing up anyway. It was about seeing injustice and refusing to look away. And that kind of courage? It was contagious. Finally, if you've stayed with me until now, thank you so much for spending your time on Grace and Nathan's story. If you believe like I do that truth and courage can change lives, then please don't leave in silence. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. If this story touched you, please like the video and share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And before you click away, leave me a comment. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up against injustice, even when it was risky? I'll read each and every comment. The end.